Hi everyone, and welcome to CSI Skill Tree. In this series, we take a close look at video games to examine and celebrate the work they do in envisioning the future and building rich, thought-provoking worlds. My name is Joey Eschrick at the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University, and I'll be your host. Today we're going to talk about Outer Wilds, an immersive adventure game about unraveling the mysteries of a solar system caught in a time loop. Outer Wilds was released in 2019. It was developed by the independent studio Mobius Digital and published by Annapurna Interactive. The game is directed by Alex Beecham, who started it as a master's thesis project at USC's Interactive Media program. The game was a critical smash. It received dozens of award nominations, and it was named Game of the Year at the Golden Joystick Awards as well as the British Academy Games Awards. Outer Wilds is available on several platforms to play, Windows, Nintendo Switch, as well as PlayStation and Xbox consoles. And in September of this year, an expansion was released titled Echoes of the Eye, but today we're just going to be talking about the original main game. And I'm delighted to be joined by two fantastic guests. First, Randy Smith, a video game director and designer. Hi, Randy. Welcome. Randy's known for his work on the Thief series, the indie sci-fi gardening game Waking Mars, and Jet: The Far Shore, which came out just last month. And actually, Randy and I met because his game Waking Mars was the focus of the second episode of this CSI Skill Tree series. And so it's been amazing to learn from him and hear his insights on how interactivity creates meaning and aesthetic effects for players. And that's a theme we'll be talking about much more in this conversation. I'm also honored to be joined by Luke Riesbeck, space policy and research analyst at Astroscale US. Hi, Luke.
Hi.
So glad you're with us.
Thanks for having me.
At Astroscale, Luke works to build comprehensive solutions for orbital sustainability and to ensure the long-term stewardship of space environments. He's a graduate of the Space Policy Master's Program at George Washington University and also holds degrees in social science and global China studies. Luke's expertise in preparing for this has been so instructive in understanding how Outer Wilds builds on and complicates and reframes current debates about our relationship with space. So thank you both so much. This has been, as usual, an incredibly educational experience playing this video game. So thanks. So we'll start off by talking a bit about the game's story, structure, and mechanics, and how it incorporates and uses elements of player immersion and simulation. And while we're doing that, we'll run a gameplay video in the background featuring clips from a few short forays, journeys I made and recorded, and showing you some of the game's main mechanics and tools and modes of exploration, which are things we'll probably touch on as we talk. You'll learn, among other things, from watching this that I'm very bad at landing. I don't do that very well, and pretty good at getting like marooned in hostile corners of the galaxy and falling off of ledges. So I should say that none of these clips should spoil any major plot points. The idea is if you've played this game before, great, you'll have a lot to hang on to. And if you haven't, this will hopefully orient you and get you interested, hopefully. So we'll try to avoid any major spoilers. The game's really narrative driven, so we'll try to stay away from, reveals in the game's later stages, certainly. But we will, I should say, talk about some narrative twists and turns, but you should be fine and we won't ruin anything for you. After the opening segment, we'll delve more deeply into the game's approach to exploration and discovery, its cultures and civilizations, how it depicts the scientific process and the search for knowledge, and how it builds on other narratives and media about space exploration. And then we'll have a good chunk of time to respond to questions and comments. So to that end, throughout the conversation, please anytime use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window to submit a question or comment. And you can do that anytime. You don't have to wait until we're addressing those questions. Just if you think of something, drop it in there, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you all so much for joining us. And without further ado, let's get underway. So now I have to do the messy business of sharing my screen. So I'm going to do that. Okay. So, Luke, Randy, you can see the video?
Yes.
Okay, great. Cue me dying a bunch of times. All right, so I'd like to start actually, Luke, by asking you to tell us a little bit about the story of Outer Wilds and how it introduces us to its world and what you're actually doing while you play. I mean, I said like mystery and adventure and all this stuff, but like, what are you actually up to in this game?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So Outer Wilds is a game where you play as the newest member of a space exploration and expedition crew from your home planet of Timber Hearth. So you're leaving for the first time when you first start the game, and There we go. Hanging out with some of our crew members back on Timber Hearth. And essentially throughout the game, you are searching for clues about a mysterious alien ancient civilization called the Nomai. And you spend a lot of time in the game learning how to navigate the solar system, which is like a lot of space games, physically difficult to do. There's a lot of trial and error, actually piloting and navigating throughout the environment. And you are investigating ruins. You are unveiling and trying to sort of form your own theories about the remnants of the Nomai technology that you find scattered around these different systems. And you're sort of swept up in the physics of each place that you go to. Each of the sort of planets in the small solar system here, which that's perfect timing, has their own very unique and distinct like biome in terms of its atmosphere and what's going on there, but also in terms of what it's like to physically try to navigate through that space. So every 22 minutes or so, the sun right there at the center of your solar system experiences a supernova. It contracts and then explodes in a big blue sort of fireball. And everything in the solar system is destroyed. But courtesy of a very sort of mystical and strange connection that you form with a Nomai statue prior to that first takeoff, as the supernova envelops you, the memories of the journey that you've taken within that 22-minute period, and any of the sort of key findings that you've unveiled are recorded. Your memories are recorded, and that new information is stored in your ship's log. And both you and that ship log information are transported back in time to just before your launch, when you started back on Timber Hearth. So each sort of time loop, as it is repeating over these 22-minute periods, it grants you a window that you can sort of gradually learn more about each of these different locations. You are a little pressed for time. 22 minutes is not enough time to really explore more than one place at a time. So you are sort of encouraged to find your own way. There's no set order in which you have to explore things. But you learn more about, like I said, the physics of each place, and you sort of get through the often maze-like environments at each location. And you're also able to check in on your crew that's stationed around the solar system. So you gradually piece together both what the ancient civilization, the Nomai, were doing in this solar system, and the technology that they built, what its purposes were, and also why they aren't still around today. So as you can see from this footage, it is a lot of trial and error with navigating these different environments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I should say this video that is playing, our ingenious editor Arvind made a great decision, I think, with all the footage I captured, and ran a bunch of it at triple speed. So it often looks like you're moving really fast, but that's only because we wanted to just show more stuff and show more process. So there isn't like a Sonic the Hedgehog but in the game.
I wish there was.
Yeah.
But yeah, so because nobody else that's in your expedition crew is sort of aware that this time loop is happening, it's very Groundhog Day like that. It's kind of up to you to uncover if it can be broken and how it could be broken. So so you have your very trusty spaceship that's very cozy that you fly around and land mostly precariously, and your ship log. So that acts as sort of a combined map and sort of scientific journal to record your progress.
And you have to kind of form a mental map a little bit of the system as you're traversing it a bit. I mean, for me, it was like, the game has a bunch of great interfaces for maps and that ship log that you were talking about, Luke, but then like, you do kind of need to decide like, okay, I should probably come back to check this out or that out right. As time goes on. And so there are a bunch of
Yeah,
there is a sort of demand on you to like almost, cognitively or otherwise, like keep a sort of notebook of things you want to go check out,
sure.
and you get to decide on what order that happens in, and it often feels
Yeah.
like you're finding things out in a very nonlinear way and having to piece them together.
Oh, completely. Much more so than most games that I've played before. So, but that what was just playing on the screen, that sort of purple cybernetic cryptic language coming out of the screen there is what happens when you finish one of those either 22-minute periods and get killed by the supernova, or you die some other way, crash landing or running out of oxygen or something like that. So yeah, and then you start a new loop, do it again.
So, Randy, to extend on that and sort of to maybe build on what Luke was introducing, when we were talking about this game initially, you helped us by explaining that it's part of a genre called immersive simulations or immersive sims. Could you tell us a little bit about that and unpack that for us a bit? And maybe from the game designer's perspective, telling us a bit about how the game unfolds itself and what makes it so successful and engaging.
Yeah, I mean, so for lack of a better way to describe it, you could say that immersive sim is like a genre of games. So like there's like racing games or sports games or shooters, and then there's immersive sims is sort of similarly like a type of that category. And actually, my career started. I did a lot of work in immersive sims, and it was funny that it wasn't until our preparatory discussion that I was like, "Oh yeah, Outer Wilds totally qualifies as immersive sim." I think the reason that didn't jump out at me at first is because its tone is a lot more wholesome, and friendly. And immersive sims typically tend to be a little bit more gritty and realistic or whatever. But so this includes games like the Thief series that I worked on, or Deus Ex, or BioShock, or System Shock. That's what the immersive sim genre is. But the way it's defined is with those two terms, immersive and sim. So immersive is this idea that we as the developers would like the players to feel like the reality of the game is their reality, like to like close that gap between the experience your character is having and you as a human being who's just playing a video game, eliminating the fourth wall and stuff like that. And one of the most common tools we do this with is with the first person camera. So that's like we see here in Outer Wilds, the camera that's inside the character you play's head. And so you as the player always see what your character is seeing. And the sim of immersive sim refers to simulation. And all games have some amount of simulation, but the approach that's a little bit different with immersive sims is this idea that we simulate the whole world and not just what's relevant to the player, and at all times. So, I like to say that most games have like sort of a little bubble of reality that follows the player around, and everything in the simulation is very much centered on the player. And if it's not currently in the player's purview, we don't care and we don't simulate it. But immersive sims are different because things on the other side of the world will continue being simulated even when they're not immediately relevant to the player. So in the Thief games I worked on, there might be guard patrols on the other side of the castle from where the player is, and we the designers might not know why that's important, or it might be because, hey, maybe the player left them a trap and they're only going to fall into the trap if they continue patrolling and so forth. So it's kind of like a little bit of extra simulation work that is intended to have the whole world be continuously simulated and not just privilege the part that's relevant to the player. And this kind of leads into, I think, three of Outer Wilds' most defining characteristics, the ones that you'll hear people talk about when they talk about Outer Wilds. And the first is that first-person camera I mentioned is like they're extremely devoted to it here in Outer Wilds. Like you're always looking through your character's eyes when you're walking on a planet's surface. When you put on your spacesuit, you see the helmet come down over you. When you want to pilot your craft, you'll see yourself sit down in the cockpit, and while you're going between planets, you're looking through the cockpit screen and so forth. So you're always in first person. It's got that immersive quality to it. And then the simulation is really one of the things that I find the most delightful about Outer Wilds. And essentially, it's this solar system where everything is very realistically simulated. There's a sun at the center. There's planets that orbit around the sun. They spin on their axes. They have moons and other orbital bodies that are also having their motions, and it's always continuously being simulated. It's very thorough, and it leads to these very different experiences than you might see in other games. So, for example, the day-night loop in a lot of games is usually formed by having an animation of the sun like traverse the sky, and then we'll usually like turn off and on some lights. And when you see the shadows move or the color of the light change, it's because we kind of animated that. Whereas in Outer Wilds, when the sun moves across the sky, it's because you're literally standing on a sphere that's spinning, and then the sun, which is the light source, is appearing in view when you're on the correct side of the planet. And it creates other phenomena too, like if another planetary body occupies a space, happens to come between you and the sun, you'll see its shadow on the ground, which is like an eclipse or a transit. So all these solar phenomenon, astrophysical phenomenon happen in real time due to the simulation, not because it's sort of programmed in advance. So it's a very, very thorough, very deep simulation. And the third characteristic is, it's hard to talk about all that without mentioning it, but you can see it here on screen, which is that the solar system of Outer Wilds is very, very tiny. The planets are so small that you can easily see their curvature when you're standing on the surface. The space between planets is so tiny that like when you're going from one planet to the other, you should watch it or you might accidentally bump into one. And obviously that's very different than the reality of the solar system that we live in. And all of these things together add up to some pretty interesting aesthetics that starts to get at what the meaning of Outer Wilds is, or what it's communicating. And when I say aesthetics here, I don't just mean visual, like what it looks like, but how it feels to play the game, what the interactive aesthetics, what the game mechanics and the players' interactions with them, what kind of feeling that creates. And one of them, I think, is the first person makes it a very personal experience. It's very immediate. It doesn't have this like removed, distant vibe where if we cut to like a cinematic third person camera of you going from one planet to the other or something, and you're like, oh yeah, that's me traveling between the planets. Like, no, you are always right there in your character's head. It is your solar system in your world. And I think that starts to get at one of the things I really like about Outer Wilds is a sense of responsibility. I imagine I'll come back to talk about that later. But the other one is just that the clockwork solar system, this sense that you're in a living, breathing, constantly moving orrery. It creates fascination for our own, solar system and how it operates. Like I'm a person who's really endlessly fascinated by moon phases. I can look up at the moon and think like, okay, so I'm, an observer who's standing on a giant sphere, and the reason I see this crescent must be because the sun is over there, and its light is tangent on the moon. And I think of all these things, and in Outer Wilds, you can like watch them happen very rapidly in real time and be like, oh yeah, that's why the sun rises every day or whatever. So it really helps to create this sense of wonder, which I think is another hallmark of Outer Wilds.
Yeah, I think the thing that your description of the immersive sim kept reminding me of, Randy, is actually a colleague of ours at Arizona State University, Matt Bell, who's also a great novelist who just released a wonderful climate book called Appleseed. But he wrote this book about Baldur's Gate 2 for the Boss Fight book series. And, that's a role-playing game. And the sense in that game that he gets, and the book is very philosophical, is that he feels like the whole world is static until he appears, that it leads to this really solipsistic kind of point of view on the part of the player, because you're always the one turning the gears to make the story happen, and everybody is just kind of in suspended animation in a way that's increasingly creepy the more you think about it in these games, until you show up and like shine your narrative light on them and move things forward. But then in this game, you really do get the sense that as you visit these planets, they in 22 minutes really transform. The water levels will change. I fell down this sand pit in the video we just watched, and that pit fills up throughout the 22 minutes and occludes some features of the planet that you might find interesting. So it's like things are changing. I think some of the characters move around. So based on when you arrive, places, different things are happening. And it gives you the sense that while you're the narrative mover, you're not like the center of the universe necessarily. So it's a whole different feeling. Luke, go ahead, please.
Just agreeing with what you're saying. It's actually one of the things that I would understand being, at first sort of turned off by, is that there is so little that actually caters to what you are doing at any one time. You have to try and try again. And that's not, I think, something that is necessarily super, unless you have that sort of strong narrative drive. That's something that you have to be willing to like really spend some time to master. It stands in very stark contrast to a lot of space media, which is all about humanity and it's always focused on ourselves, even as we're exploring other places. Yeah.
So Luke, one thing I wanted to ask you as someone who works in the space, industry or realm world, does this sense that, does the game remind you of other simulations that might be either in other media, right, other entertainment media, or simulations that are used in actual, space regulation, planning, space science? Like, does the game is it in dialogue in any way with like other, the other kind of types of simulations that humans are creating of space and space systems?
Yeah. Yeah, well, definitely from like an educational standpoint, playing this game reminded me a lot of some of the planetariums that I've been to, and like the educational presentations that they give about where you can sort of zoom into different stars and, like nebulas forming and things like that. And the lecturer can sort of teach you more about what's happening in our, our galaxy and beyond. So that definitely, rings true with Outer Wilds, even though the visual style is very much almost cartoony and kind of toy-like. But in terms of, how when we're operating spacecraft, either satellites or space stations or rockets in actual space, we are actually still getting a lot better at being able to really map what that environment looks like. Even the the Earth orbital environment is something that is it's very, there's a lot going on. It's very busy. It's very cluttered, even for such a wide expanse of physical space. And so ensuring that we can operate things there within a reasonable amount of risk, and how we are actually able to track everything there is something that we're actually still making like current very iterative improvements on now, from a physical observation side through things like telescopes and radars, things like that, and also on the processing side of like, how do we possibly compile all of this data into actionable information that helps us operate things more safely and more efficiently. So yeah, it actually is something that we're still kind of on the front end of the learning curve on that, I would say, even now.
Yeah, there's something in this game, talking about those models for debris and sort of all the complexities of constructing them and then dealing with them and trying to actually use them. There's something nice and clean and Newtonian about this game, right? It does have that, Randy used the term orrery, like it has that kind of model effect. Yeah. And you can really kind of, like when you zoom out to that map that I showed a few times in the video, like you can really understand what's going on. Now, whether you can actually then understand the physics well enough, in my case, to then navigate anywhere without using the autopilot, which the game is, delightfully includes, is another thing. I do think it's like, it's one of these things where the game looks almost, it has some similarities with like I don't know, it reminds me of Banjo-Kazooie, the old Nintendo 64 game, but like something about the aesthetic of it feels like very welcoming and very cute almost when you first get started, especially and you're going around Timber Hearth, but then like it's kind of hardcore in a way, the physics. I think that's one of the interesting wrinkles when you start playing, I think, is that you don't necessarily realize, unless you read the promotional material in depth in advance, that you're going to die after 22 minutes no matter what, or that you might like die in any other number of ways, and that also like it's really possible to just like miss the planet that you're going to or whatever. It really reminds one of how much most space games just have nothing to do with actual physics. Like they might have a physics system of their own, but like this one, at least to me, felt like it felt hard enough that I felt like it probably was partaking a bit more in the like actual, again, Newtonian like physical realities of trying to catch up to and land on things safely and things like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of behind the scenes work going on there to make it feel that way, for sure. And the for myself, the first, I think, 3 or 4 hours of the game, I actually had my settings adjusted in a way that I thought was going to make it easier to control my ship. And so I was actually completely making it much harder for myself. And so I had to fiddle with those a little bit in terms of my ship looking speed and things like that. So that way I was able to navigate a little bit easier. So yeah, it started off a lot harder for me, but then I realized that I was probably doing that to myself inadvertently. So yeah.
So getting into that verb of, or jumping off from that verb navigation a little bit, or that concept of navigation, I guess, the verb navigate. We've talked a little bit about how open the game is. It's sort of curiosity driven. It sort of leaves the uncovering of the mystery to you very much. You don't necessarily get a huge amount of information either in dialogue, like some of the dialogue is revealing, but it's not really like you have to go and actually explore things on your own. How does that shape the experience, that sense of openness? And perhaps, and I think this is really the point of what I'm asking, is like, to what extent, like, and how is the game built around the idea of exploration, of discovery, and even of experimentation? Like, how do those kind of imperatives shape the experience? And like, again, what's the game kind of like up to and focusing on? What does it sort of want from you as a player, or hope you'll have in terms of an experience?
Yeah, there's this, one of the responses to that is this term player ownership. It reminds me of, and this is pretty, oftentimes coupled with immersive sims, which I talked about earlier. But it's this idea that unlike compared to other games, the game does very little to like prod the player forward or give them overt guidance on like what to do, like how to solve a problem, or even like what to think, like how to interpret the material in front of them. And instead, it creates a whole lot of space for the player to go about this themselves. And part of the open-endedness, like from the beginning of the game, you can go to any of the planets, is there's not a lot of, after this initial training sequence, there's not a lot of ordering. It's very open-ended. But it also, like the simulation and other aspects, give you just the player a lot of space to, find their own solutions or create their own problems that they maybe have to try to solve, or even create their own interpretations about what's going on. So that's what player ownership is. I mean, some examples would be, from my own experience towards the beginning of the game, I was really drawn into this one planet, which is called Brittle Hollow. And there's a lot of, you land on the surface and there's a lot of access down into the interior of the planet. And I was like, oh, I'm in some kind of like cave-like environment. And sometimes I'd see like explosions. I didn't really know what was going on. And again, this comes from the fact that it's all first person, so it's a much more limited camera view and a way for presenting information. And again, the burden is on the player to figure this out. It doesn't give you like convenient camera angles to see what's going on. And so long story short, I eventually realized that what was going on is the planet's just a shell, and I was inside a hollow planet, and portions of it are breaking and falling into the core of the planet. So already there's like a little bit of like, oh, I own this realization. It wasn't handed to me on a silver platter. And then to take it from there, inevitably you will fall into the core of this planet. And what you'll discover there is that you teleport, and suddenly you appear on the outskirts of the solar system. And this is a death sentence, right? Like for me, like one time I think I like accidentally drifted, I'm trying to save myself because here I am stranded without my ship and my suit. And, one time I drifted into the sun and incinerated. Another time I just like ran out of fuel and oxygen and died. But then eventually, the third or so time that I'm out here, I was like, okay, let's think this through. And one of the things that eventually I discovered is actually a while later is that I was in a debris field, and there's this debris in front of me. And it becomes much easier to see if you get closer to the sun and turn around. And because then it's like lit in the correct side instead of just being kind of like rim lit when you're behind it. And also you can see that there's a white hole. And so what's happened is you've fallen into a black hole and appeared in a white hole. And again, none of this is like conveniently presented to you. At all. No, you just have to figure this out yourself. And the game is not going to guide you into that knowledge. And but one of the most exciting moments was that eventually I'm like, okay, well, what's in this debris field? And I got close enough for my headlight to illuminate it. And I realized it was like an artifact of this ancient alien civilization. It was like an old space station. And, it was clearly derelict at this point. And I don't want to spoil too much about what happens inside, but you get close enough, you see there's a hatch and you can go inside. So you go from being stranded to having this thing to explore. And there's like this, the trope of the derelict spaceship is a thing that we see a lot in entertainment. And it was really different and powerful here because of this idea of player ownership, because it wasn't handed to me. It wasn't like, well, now it's chapter 3. So every player is going to have this experience where we like set them up, their ship discovers a derelict spaceship, we put them right in front of the hatch. Okay, go. No, I had to do the whole thing. I created that experience myself. I mean, the designers knew it was likely to happen, of course, but they didn't push me into it. I wasn't prodded forward into it. Another example is there's no landing pads in the game where it's like you get close enough and then it's like, okay, now we cut to a third person view of you landing and now you can get out, and it's always, no, every moment of that is continuous and you have to land your craft yourself, and you can go ahead and land it really badly if you want. You can park it wherever you want in space, or like in my own case, in trees sometimes, because I also am not the world's most perfect pilot. There was an experience one time where I walked away from my ship on the watery planet and a wave put my craft in a tree.
Same thing happened to me. Yeah, well, except mine got swallowed up, and then I tried to swim down to it, and it turns out you really can't do that, or at least I couldn't. So yeah.
So that's what we call an emergent problem. Like I kind of created for myself this problem, and now here's my ship in a tree, and I have to try to figure out how to get to it. And again, this wasn't like chapter 6 of the game that the designer knew everyone is going to have this experience. Some players never have that experience, but it sounds like all 3 of us did. And then, there's the emergent solution of like, well, how am I going to get in? And, I tried to like climb to the cliff above my tree and jump down to land in the little elevator thing. And so that's me using the simulation and the rules of the game and the tools that I had available to me to try to solve it. And again, coming back to aesthetics, like how does this contribute to what Outer Wilds is about? I think there's a sense that, with all the things we've talked about, the hands-offishness that I was just describing, the simulation, there's this sense that nothing in this world, there's a problem in this world, and nothing is going to get solved unless I step up and solve it. Like I'll just be stuck in this loop forever and nothing will ever get better. And I think that's partially also where I come to this idea that responsibility is part of what I take away from Outer Wilds. Like there's a sense that like this is my solar system and I have to step up if I want things to change.
Yeah. It's so interesting because like I definitely came away with that kind of sense of obligation as well. But I think my perspective on it was kind of shifted in that without spoiling too much about like towards the later stages of the game, I am just the kind of player in any game that I play where I like to go talk to every single villager and like, pick every apple off every tree. I like am very much do everything, spend as much time as I want to wherever I go. So a game like Outer Wilds that is essentially just a series of timed trials of discover as much as you can and translate as much of this ancient text as you can, as fast as you can, because you're gonna have to start again in the next loop. It was definitely like a challenge to get myself to relax and get back into that. You can take your time, sort of a space. So that sense of obligation was like pressing and there, but it was less about it was more about unraveling the mystery of how this was even happening in the first place than a strong narrative drive to like preserve the Hearthian side of things. I found myself learning a lot more about the Nomai than I did about like the Timber Hearth people, the Hearthians. Yeah.
You had like the completion compulsion where you like wanted to see every single thing and collect everything. Yeah. And like in that sense, the time loop, as a game design element is a little bit of a blessing and a curse. Like I like that it moves us forward at all times. It creates a little bit of urgency around this idea of scientific exploration, but on the counter side, it enforces like a style of exploration, which isn't my natural case, where I would really like to spend my time really examining things and experimenting and trying things out to fully understand it, make sure I read everything. And in this game, it's like, no, keep moving. You finally got into this space. Okay, hurry up and read everything. Hurry up and make sure you touch everything to know what's going on because it's going to end soon, which I imagine was sort of a challenge a balance that the game developers were trying to walk.
Yeah, definitely.
One thing that strikes me here is that there's kind of some design elements of the game that are in tension, right? Like, because as we've talked about with kind of experimentation and finding your own way and sort of developing hypotheses about what might be happening and then going to have to use your 22 minutes iteratively to check them. There's a scientific method kind of vibe to what you're doing here. And I'd like to hear what you all think about that. But then in tension with that is the demands of the time loop. So there's the game's kind of narrative conceit in tension with some of the grammar of interaction, I think, and the kind of, ethos of like planning and executing your play. And I wonder what you all think about that. And you're already talking around how you handled it, which is why I was like thinking about bringing it up. But to what extent is the game sort of quote unquote about doing science? And then to what extent, is the time loop supportive of that or in tension with it or undercutting it in a way?
Yeah, I mean, something I heard you say, Joey, is it's not like you play a card-carrying scientist who's doing that kind of like official formal science, but
Yeah.
you do have this, the real loop of how you play the game is you explore, you go to some new place, then you observe, you're like, oh, what does this contraption do? Or like, here's the problem, how am I going to solve it? Then you like form a hypothesis, like, oh, maybe I'll try using this tool on it, or maybe if I can get this, come here earlier in the time loop and try this thing, and so you have a hypothesis, and then you run that experiment, you try it out, and then you loop back to observe and see how the experiment played out, and actually the funny thing to me is that that is in a lot of ways like science. Again, it's not like formal card carrying science, but it's got a scientific vibe to it. The funny thing to me is it's like, this is actually kind of true of all software. Like if you get an app to control the thermostat in your house or something like this, you have a very similar experience, even though the developers wanted you to know exactly how it works and have all the information. You're like, oh, geez, I want to change the temperature dew point. How do I find, is this tab okay? And you're observing, you're guessing, you're making hypotheses, you're trying out. Maybe if I change this control, oh no, I guess that's not it. Let's go back to this other tab. And so that's already kind of a loop that's like endemic to all software and how humans interface with it, I think. And Outer Wilds, as we often do in entertainment software, has done a really superb job, like gamifying that, like giving it some narrative and giving it some exciting game elements. But it's kind of how we use software. It's already kind of got this ghost of the scientific process built into it.
Yeah. And I think actually something that connects there for me was when you both were saying sort of like formal science, card carrying science, and that's not what's going on here, that you're much more of like a ragtag kind of cabin-y sort of motley crew that is going through these different simulations, yourself and your other crewmates that are either stranded or just resting and hanging out on these other places. And that's actually really interesting to me because some of the text that is present around the game are left by the Nomai basically talking to each other, and not just sort of the initial generations of Nomai that were there, but subsequent generations trying to figure out the riddle of the situation that they find themselves in and expressing their own sort of feelings of self-doubt or feelings of how on earth can I be the person that's taking over this incredible work that has come before me, and like inheriting this canon of science in that civilization. And that was like a very human element of the story, because that is completely how like modern science works, whether that's within studies like physics or even engineering, like physically building things and iterating on designs of how to do things. It can be very intimidating if you have any sort of sense of awareness of like engineering history. Like if you look at space, like for the Apollo missions, they sent people to the moon with like less processing power that's in my iPhone, right? And it's like, if you look at that kind of whatever the like rationalizations were for doing those kinds of missions or today's missions, if you are conducting your work from a perspective of I'm continuing the line of like human ingenuity or human like knowledge creation and seeking knowledge and discovery, it can so easily be something that you start to have like an existential crisis about a little bit. So that was something that like in piecing together like the different clues and even like navigating and doing trial and error with different puzzles, learning what switches and knobs operate what. I think that was something for me that that sort of following in the footsteps of giants mentality is 100% how all science has always been conducted. On the micro level and on the macro level across like human history, we're very good at idolizing the people that came before us and thinking that we are not capable of that same kind of discovery and that same kind of creation of knowledge. Yeah,
I think to continue a theme of my reactions to you two, I think that like, again, this is a point of productive tension in the game where you're alone. As Randy pointed out, there's a great commitment to this first person perspective. And in fact, because of that, like in a lot of games, you don't, I think, learn a terribly large amount about your own character, like, because you're funneled through them. They're your focalizer, I guess, for the universe. But on the other hand, it's not the game includes a number of things, including, Luke, I think all of the text and so the lineage text around this predecessor civilization, but also, and it's not covered in the snippets we showed, but there's a museum of sort of exploration and discovery on your home planet. That's a part of your introduction to the game as a player. And everybody who is on your planet in one way or another is kind of invested in and contributing to your voyage, right? Whether they built the platform or somebody wants to like cut down a tree to like clear out areas for a new launch platform that'll be safer, or somebody trains you in navigating zero gravity with your jetpack. You go into this mine and fly around in there. And there is, and then of course you're part of Outer Wilds, and there's, in addition to the official museum, a little like kind of outdoor jaggedy Outer Wilds museum, which has like all of these like broken spaceship parts from like earlier ventures in the Outer Wilds, which is your little space program in the trajectory of Outer Wilds. And it does give you a sense, I think, that you're part of a community and part of a lineage, even if, again, like your experience of play is that you're very alone and sometimes kind of lonely and isolated in this game.
Yeah, and I think in general, sort of like different disciplines of science, and even within the same field, like aeronautics and astrophysics, space studies generally, going so deep into a field rather than like going wide and seeing how those fields contribute to each other, is one of the reasons that science, as it's currently practiced and as it's sort of been operationalized today, is it kind of often misses that bigger picture. Some of the best scientific contributions to like major steps in discovery for human existence and just like the course of our universe have been when people from like diametrically opposed fields collaborate on research and use the tools of each other's fields to see the observations and data that they work with from a new perspective. So I think, in the course of the narrative of this game, having a science museum in general is an interesting way that that's presented, as opposed to, I don't know, like a library or an archive, right? So, because it's, museums are meant to be toured around and shared. It's something that they're building and uncovering that history together and sharing it with the rest of the people on the planet. It's not something that they're hoarding away for their own knowledge.
So one thing I want to turn to that I think, again, is running along parallel with some of the things we've been talking about is the way that space exploration as a venture, as an endeavor, is sort of framed and justified in this game. So we have two different civilizations. We have the contemporary one, the Harthians, and then we have their predecessors, the Nomai, who've left their, artifacts and detritus and partially defunct space stations and such all over the galaxy. And each of them has a justification for like why to go to space, what's out there in space, what's the point. And I think that, to me, as an outsider and dilettante in this field, like it feels like in space policy and the politics of space, and Luke, you can tell us a bit more about that question always does have to get answered as to like, why is this worthwhile? Why is it worth the risk to human or animal life? Why is it worth the carbon emissions? Why is it worth the incredible amounts of human capital and monetary capital and physical resources? So I wonder if you all could talk about how the game frames that out, and then how you responded to that, like why to go to space, and like what's up there, and what the opportunities and thrills are, and why it's such a compelling endeavor.
Yeah, I can try to take that first. There's definitely a lot of different threads there to pull on.
The typical question for me. There's like 45 questions in here.
No, that's fine.
It's a choose your own adventure question.
Okay, good. Yeah, I mean, I think in this particular game, it is a nice break from a lot of modern fiction narratives about space exploration that you see in like TV shows and films of like, basically since 2000 mostly, which are, those are almost always framed as, climate disaster fantasy movies, right? Like, the Earth is destroyed. It's past the point of repair. We have to find some kind of alternative. That's something that is still a justification that's utilized for a lot of sort of further out human space exploration programs, especially those that aren't, like part of national government programs. But it's, this game in particular is, it kind of manages to slide away from that kind of geometry of most space exploration stories about, it doesn't really come from a point of failure and fear and like trying to, like in a panic, trying to find something else. Even though there is this supernova happening and this mystery that you have to uncover about it, there's more of an impulse to come up with a creative approach and try to piece something together. And as you progress, later and later in the game, whatever you do end up learning about the feasibility of sort of saving the day, I guess, at the end, it is still something that you are able to frame from a like hopeful, optimistic kind of approach. That's definitely in contrast, I think, to to some of the other space games that are out there and space films. Tying that to like actual justifications for real life space exploration, they definitely vary. But initial human spaceflight exploration, in the space race, was definitely born of a geopolitical and technical clash between the US and the Soviet Union at the time. There was a very explicit political rationalization there as, this is an American frontierism, American supremacy, white supremacy project that continued, in the vein of the European exploration and imperialism over the Americas and in the Pacific, right? So it doesn't actually take much digging if you like look back through American history, modern American history. You can see presidents, all the way from JFK to Trump talking about space exploration and frame it from that kind of manifest destiny, sort of a rugged pioneer kind of perspective, with all of the baggage that includes, often explicitly so, right? But there are definitely elements of space and I guess other frontiers, whether that's the ocean or just jungles, the wilds, open fields, things like that, even down into the earth itself. All of the narratives around those kinds of fields, those kinds of stories, take for granted that the people conducting those missions have a right to do that, are in the right, and that they are done, and the kind of collateral damage of that is definitely an afterthought, even when it is other people, right? So I think that's something that in Outer Wilds specifically, your perspective is what the player brings to it. And as we mentioned, the Harthians themselves are kind of neutral. They are just trying to learn more about this ancient civilization. They don't have a negative or animosity towards the Nomai, even though the Nomai were dwelling within their system all those years ago. And who knows if they were a peaceful civilization or not. They're humanized in the text they leave to each other. So it's kind of up to the player to come to their own conclusions on that.
Yeah, the way it's written, it tethers together anthropological kind of exploration with space exploration. Because in order to find out about this civilization that's like clearly like kind of reshaped things in their galaxy or in their star system rather, and done all of this stuff, they don't really know what, but like clearly have had a big effect and built all these structures. in order to try to understand what that civilization was trying to do, they have to actually, and then you as the player by extension have to understand the astrophysical phenomena. Like in a weird way, the game kind of hinges together the two kind of features of something like Star Trek, where there's astrophysical phenomena and anomalies, and then there's all of this cultural exploration. You see that especially in something like Next Generation, where there's this strong anthropological vibe. And here, you don't actually, you're largely interacting with ruins and text that you're translating and things like that, but you're trying to learn about another culture and another civilization. But the only way to do it is to actually understand it's very materialist in a way, the sort of geophysical structure of the planets and how the system itself works, which is kind of a cool tethering together.
Yeah, I think that's...
Randy, what did you make of the justification? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, to riff on what you were saying, I think that's in part because that's what we can do well in games, is sort of like the how things work. I would assume that the Outer Wilds developers care very much about why the Nomai go to space, or what the player should feel about exploring space. It's just I mean, you can see it right here in Outer Wilds. Like, what we are good at in video games is things like flying ships and using devices and other mechanical sorts of simulations. And when you talk in Outer Wilds to another character, it's much more discrete and just simple branching interactions. It's like a menu of, it's very common in games, a menu of conversation options. So the richness over here of like how to accomplish things is very much stronger than what we have in terms of discussing why. And so I think one's just a proxy for the other. Like, by solving these physical problems, the player stays involved in the Nomai and their culture, and the player still has the freedom to come up with their own, as I said earlier, their own interpretations of what's going on or what it means to them. But it's just not something that is gamified as much. But yeah, I mean, in terms of, I had a lot of responses. I think one of the things that's interesting about the colonialism, well, let me put it this way. I think the Harthians, the species you play, it seems like they go to space to satisfy their curiosity. They're like, literally go to, every planet and then set up a hammock and hang out. It's like, so they're
roast some marshmallows.
Like, their ambition kind of stopped at like, let's see what's in our solar system, and like, oh, what do you know? There's these ancient aliens we should investigate someday. The Nomai, the ancient aliens, they kind of treat our solar system like their laboratory. Like, it's, they have planet scale problems they want to solve, and they're using the elements of our solar system and this drive to sort of, and when I say problem, it's not like something that must be solved, but rather like, wouldn't that be cool if we figured out how to do this? And I think this is where some of the very good points Luke made about colonialism come in. It's not like we don't get it. The Nomai are depicted very sympathetically, and they have some words and gestures which are among the most heartfelt I've seen in a video game. But at the same time, like, here they are just deciding that they are allowed to manipulate these awesome forces of the solar system towards this thing that doesn't need to be done. So like, there's a little bit of ambiguity and a little bit of bite into how they're depicted. But both of those cultures, I think, are just kind of the framework, and really where I would look to see what the devs have to say, the developers have to say about space travel and the reason to explore space is what the player experience is, which is a little bit different than either. As we talked about, there's this sense of like wonder and learning and experimenting and unraveling the mysteries you discover. But there's also this survival imperative where it's like, well, unless somebody figures this thing out, there could be dire consequences. And there's also this pretty cool reality check, because a lot of the game's fiction has to do with like how time works or quantum mechanics. And so I think there's this discussion about like, well, what is reality really, and how does it work? And so I think that's a lot of that is probably where the dev's heart is, somewhere in that neighborhood, about like, why go to space? What would be cool about it?
So, Luke, you're muted. Do you want to?
I sure am.
Somebody had to do it. It was going to be me. So I'm glad that you did it first.
I just one more. I know we're probably going to switch.
Go ahead, and then please, yeah, say what you'd like to say. I would love to hear, and we'll go to a couple questions from our audience.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. One of the things I wanted to make sure that I brought up and touched on this game about this game is one of the tools that you have is what's called a signal scope, which you equip, that it can be something you equip from your ship or from your suit as you're exploring on the surface of these planets. And it acts as kind of like a combined radio and tricorder, like a Star Trek tricorder kind of, but you can trace and identify and start to track the signals that are emitted by various things, like various phenomena, your crewmates and things like that. That was one of my favorite ever like mechanics I've ever used in a video game ever. Like much as somebody who definitely is very tied to like, or I get more out of like the narrative in a story than the physics of moving around a story, a game rather, like that's just, you know, how I am personally. Having something that could, you know, you could utilize from many kilometers away across a galaxy to hear one of your crewmates, you know, playing a song on your frequency was something that was, you know, just very interesting. Especially as somebody who, you know, I grew up in Ohio. I was born in West Virginia, and like all of the instruments that are utilized by the crew members are very much like home style, like mountainy, sort of backwoods instruments, or harmonicas and banjos. But the point is, they're all very social instruments. You know, they're designed to be played in a big band and community with each other, and you know, around a fire together, right? So you know, the score was fantastic, but even, you know, the music within this, you know, using this one tool, the music that you're exposed to there, and how it loops and combines together was something that was honestly so genius. That was like one of the things that felt so good to discover and trace the origins of some of those signals. Yeah, it was a really great thread that, you know, again, kind of introduced the humanity and the personality back into, you know, what you're doing, especially, you know, if you're like stuck on some kind of like platforming puzzle and you like launch the same place like 5 times in a row, you just like chill out and then go and like park and like listen to some banjo music for a while, and it's like, okay, let's try something else, you know, like it's helps you get out of the like feeling like you need to rush to everything, you know.
And I kind of want to just riff off that a little bit. Like one of the things, you know, and from a big picture perspective, what I love so much about Outer Wilds, you know, you guys referred earlier to like so many games are about like, well, it's the end of the world and we're gonna have to go colonize. That's why we're leaving Earth. You know, we've destroyed the Earth, and so it's pretty dark. Or, you know, a lot of older games and probably present games as well, but like are just unabashedly colonial. It's like, oh, we're going to other planets so we can extract their mineral resources and exploit them. And, you know, we're gonna take the species that we find, you know, living creatures on these other planets, and we're just gonna take them home because they're basically our property. We're gonna, you know, engage in a capitalist system where we sell it so we can buy bigger ships. Maybe we can conduct war someday if we're really.
Well, and so many of the big space exploration games like are about, you know, and I think ironically in some ways they're sort of with a critical bite, like resource extraction, corporate governance of the universe, right? Like, I mean, these are some of the games that I've looked at for this series that have these amazing emergent gameplay. Are about like mining, building your ship, paying fealty to a corporation, and you know that is often the horizon of imagination for
totally. And they can be really
space activity,
really excellent games, but they don't do much to question or examine that, you know, that assumption, right? And so Outer Wilds is, I think, lovely because it does have this very human, very personal touch to it. Well, it's also talking about the wonder and grandeur and the discovery and these cool elements of science and the universe. But also, as I said, has this tone to me of responsibility and what it means to be a good steward of the solar system. And I think it's a very different perspective than what we see in a lot of other sci-fi offerings, and it's pretty cool. It kind of reminds me, like, this is a weird reference, but of like the Haunting of Bly Manor, and there's a bunch of other works, but there's just one that occurs to me. It's a sci-fi TV series that's like horror, and it is horror, but actually like all of the characters are very wonderful people that you'd love to spend time with. They're very kind and sensitive people. And so that's like kind of, you know, not what you expect in horror. And I think in a similar way, Outer Wilds is not what we have normally come to expect from sci-fi. It's really touching a very nice, heartwarming, wholesome sort of quality.
Yeah. I'm really glad you all brought that up. And Luke, thank you for bringing up the music. It's something that, because of the way I've chosen to present some of the gameplay, like we always lose the music. This is actually 2 games in a row because our last episode was about Kentucky Route Zero, another game that uses kind of, I don't know, traditional, you know, US instrumentation, right? And uses some of the same instruments, and really like some of the great emotional swells are from music. And actually, even when you take off and you start to voyage into space, there's this beautiful way that the music kind of comes in. And that is more like space exploration, sci-fi music to some extent, but it's really stirring. So some of the like emotional heft of this game, I think, is carried in large part by the soundtrack. And I agree. I've used the signal scope a little bit in the clips we saw, but the way that the sounds kind of fuzz and fade in, and then when you actually go find the characters, that feels really satisfying.
Yeah.
As much as figuring out, like, you know, how the flooding cycle works in Giant's Deep or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot of emotional weight attached to the music in this game.
Yeah.
Especially there's like a really strong narrative beat that happens towards the end of the game, that music is a very focal part of that. And it's definitely no surprise. Yeah. It's well done. It feels very satisfying to experience it.
So I think we're gonna take a couple questions that we've had come in through Q&A, and then perhaps we'll have time for one more very quick question for me before we say farewell. But so first, we'll go with this one first because Zachary, you submitted it so quickly. So Zachary has a sort of a two-part question. One is, any thoughts on the design of how each planet encourages further exploration at first, and how that intertwines with the loop format that forces players not to dawdle too much? And as a follow-up, second question, but connected, how does that impact the flow of where a player might go during their journey or throughout their journey? So this is kind of taking us back a bit to the mechanics of exploration, but I think it is interesting prompt by Zachary to get us to think about like the design of each planet. And maybe, I don't know if y'all have examples of some of those systems without giving away anything too essential, but I think, you know, talking a little bit about how they fluctuate and function.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you mentioned Brittle Hollow, Randy. I spent so much time there because it is just it's so not only like visually appealing, but there is a lot of, I think it's probably one of the harder places in the game to navigate because you have to be very conscious of keeping yourself on something, whether it's a wall or a ledge. Otherwise, you know, like Randy mentioned earlier, you fall victim and fall into the black hole. So that was definitely the trickiest. And the destabilizing of the planet around you as you are trying to explore it is definitely gives a really cool atmosphere to it. But I would say, you know, something that struck out to me is that this game does a really good job in some of the, like, you know, if you go to Giant's Deep or you go to, there's a very foggy, brambly kind of nest. That's one of the areas you can go to. You know, you are not always able to like have a crystal clear view of everything, even within first person. Some things are very foggy and rainy, and your camera is obscured by waves, and you know, you're bumping into things. Like there's not you have there's a mechanic in the game that you can launch some sort of basically a launchable camera probe ahead of you, and so that can be launched way up out across horizons to kind of give you a sense of what's ahead of you. But then also it can be launched into spaces that are too small or too murky for you to navigate through yourself. And you can have it send pictures back to you, so you can see where it leads, and that ends up being a very important plot point through the story. But I think for me, the planets like that, where not only was there something happening that I couldn't see, that I knew was happening around me, that I had to try to figure out, but something that was just like physically scary, and you're sort of buffeted about by. I think those were the things that really stood out to me, because most space games are definitely everything is very sharp, crystal clear. You can see everything that's going on. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'd only add, like, I'm having that cat moment I warned that we might have. Anyway, yeah, I mean, there's some really brilliant level design that goes on in Outer Wilds that pertains to the loop and the fact that the world is continuously changing. We saw earlier, there's like sand that siphons off these two planets that are in kind of a binary orbit, and sand siphons off one to the other. So one is gradually revealed and the other is gradually filling up. And, you know, like Luke was saying about about Brittle Hollow, it's like changing its geometry as you play the game. And so there's a bunch of very smart puzzles that are like, ooh, maybe I should be at this place before this fills up completely, or so it does fill up and I can reach this other place more easily. And a lot of the time loop involves understanding the dynamics of the solar system. But I think one of the things that occurred to me about it is it does depict the solar system that's engaged in rapid change and very destructive change. So to me, that creates like the sense that it accelerates that sense of urgency and survival imperative. It's like, oh, well, if this time loop is a dangerous moment in the solar system, and we'd really like to understand it so we can see if there's something we can do to prevent it.
Yeah, yeah. And on the note of like physics stuff too, there are often things that you have to, even with the assistance of things like autopilot, you kind of have to chase down. Not everything is quite within your reach, and it does take several tries a lot of the time. So, again, as somebody who's much more like narrative and progression of a story is what compels me. Navigating the physics of physically flying and crashing a lot into things was a nice sort of like, bump me back down to earth, so to speak. Like it kind of reminds you of the limits of your influence over this game.
Yeah.
I think there was a comment in the chat about the fact that immersive sims are sometimes basically power fantasies, where you are very, very strong and have lots of influence over everything around you. So that's a bit of a refreshing beat here with Outer Wilds, I would say.
Oh yeah, you do not accrue huge quantities of power and survivability as things go on. You maybe get a little bit more expert, or the two of you do maybe, in traversing things and not dying. But it's because of your greater knowledge and perspicacity and perhaps care with the way you're doing certain things, not because your character like accrues. Even you don't even get like a huge complement of tools by the end or anything. It's not like you're like unlocking a grappling hook or anything at any point.
Yeah, it's very much like Groundhog Day in the sense that, or another example would be this film Edge of Tomorrow. But it's like, because you've done it so many times, you get better and better at it, not just physically, but also like in terms of your knowledge about how the world works or what's going to happen at what time and so forth. And I think it's literally the case that, training aside, the very first time you play the game, you could beat it. Like the very first time loop, the only thing that's preventing you from doing that is the knowledge about how to do it. And so that's a pretty astonishing accomplishment, I think, in terms of the developers.
Yeah.
So as we were talking about physics and systems, so Catherine asked a question that I'm going to read through for everyone, because it's I don't trust myself to summarize it. So this goes back to Randy when you were mentioning the game's simulation strategy of like the simulation of the system through time. So Catherine says that they're not sure if the simulation is happening. I'm not sure it's simulating the solar system by way of simulating physics. It seems like interaction with the world, for example, the spaceship, do seem to simulate at least some physics. I love the point made about the smallness of the spaces and worlds and the aesthetics that produces, and the way that the clockwork solar system moves and changes over time. Do you think that each specific process of change, like the sand accumulation or sea level change, is separately simulated, or do changes depend on other elements of the system? So like, what parts of the experience are game engine physics, and what parts of this are, quote, physics fakeries that produce an intentional effect? So so Catherine's asking, to produce the sense of actual physics, are some things simulated physically, or some things, as Catherine puts it, horrified, or maybe like simplified and schematized? So basically like the strategy and design of the simulation. Randy, do you have any thoughts about that? Or Luke, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what I would normally say here is very nuts and bolts about the, detail oriented about the implementation under the hood or whatever. I think it was tricky to pull this off, and things that aren't simulated, for example, there's not like a fluid simulation where you can modify the waves on the water planet to prevent them from capsizing something, or you can't channel the sand that's pouring from one planet to another to change how that works. So some of the things that are effectively in an animation loop, like the planets are going to spin the same way every time, and it's not like you can create a gravity well that takes them out of their orbit or something like that. So in that sense, it's not simulated to the point where the player can interfere with it or interact with it. However, it is a pretty continuous and thorough simulation anyway, apart from that. So like, it's meant to feel, other than those things that you can't interact with that theoretically you otherwise would be able to, it's meant to feel like a real simulation. You know, when you're going from one planet to another, if you get close to a third planet, you'll have a little bit of a gravity well situation, because that gravity is effectively being simulated. Under the hood, which parts are an animation, which parts are faked, which parts are, you know, more emulated and less simulated, I'm not entirely sure, but the overall effect for a player is that it might as well be like one thorough complete simulation for sure.
It definitely feels that way. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, if you compare it to like, I don't know, soft body physics simulation engines like that you can get on Steam, right? Some of these like car simulators or things like that. It definitely doesn't feel, because you can't, in some ways, because you can't interfere with it, it doesn't feel as robust. And I guess, yeah, some of it might be on rails in a way. Getting to that orrery effect of like things just sort of unfolding in the order that they unfold. And it's not as if, Randy, as you were saying, you can use your ship to like affect the orbit of a planet by crashing into it really fast or something. But then on the other hand, I think that that distinction that you made, Randy, of like whether it's quote unquote actually simulated in the code versus does it feel like a simulation, I think is in some ways the important part. Like the player experience, unless you're really trying to do that thing where you mess things up and maybe see the limits of how much you can change, it does feel like, especially flying around, you can really feel the physics. I mean, that's what makes the flying so hard, right? It's not like playing Star Fox or something.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think it's what that contributes to at the end of the day is even when you start to understand more and you kind of know the solution, and you know whether for the smaller puzzles or, you know, how to unlock things, or the sort of wider narrative story, you can still, like, because you can do what I did, for example, and, you know, be on a straight line to a planet and be almost at the surface, and then get absolutely destroyed by a meteor that I didn't even see because I wasn't even looking that direction. And it was like complete fireball before I even land, which is like one of the funniest moments I had playing this game, like laugh out loud funny. Because you know, the stakes are always there. You know, you are motivated to be moving quickly, but you do still have to be careful, because even when you know how to do something, you can slip and fall, and that's it, right? Like, yeah, it can all go in an instant. And in that way, it is true to the real risk of human space flight, right? Is that everything about space and when you're going has to be very, very carefully planned, because it is actively trying to kill you at any one time. Yeah.
So with that, I think we've reached the end of our time together. And as I expected, I had to elide and throw out a bunch of stuff that I wanted us to touch on. But I hope everybody will check out Outer Wilds. As you can tell, it's well worth playing and thinking through and enjoying. But thank you so much, Randy and Luke, for joining me today. And thank you all so much for your excellent questions and your comments in the chat as we were talking. We'll be hosting more of these CSI Skill Tree events in 2022. And now's the part where I'm going to say a bunch of URLs and then put them in chat. But you can get notified about episodes by subscribing to our YouTube channel. The link is about to be in the chat. There we go. Which is on YouTube, we're Imagine ASU. We're on Twitter at Imagination ASU. It's different for some reason. And you can also join our mailing list at csi.asu.edu and get emails about these. You can follow Luke on Twitter at Luke Riesbeck, and you can follow Randy on Twitter at wavesallday_. And again, you can see that all in the sidebar chat if you pull it up. So in addition to our panelists, I'd like to thank my colleagues at the Center for Science and the Imagination for making this event and this series possible, and especially to Aravind Hari Nair for editing our gameplay video and making a bunch of like very wise creative choices to make the kind of random assortment of footage that I was able to capture make sense and be compelling on its own. And again, for Outer Wilds, it's from Mobius Digital and Annapurna Interactive, and you can get it from for Windows. You can play it on a Nintendo Switch system, or you can get it for an Xbox or PlayStation console. So it's pretty much, with a few exceptions, available anywhere you might want to play it. And thank you all so much for taking the time to join us today. And again, Luke and Randy, for your wise insights and guidance through the game and good cheer. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. I mean, as a game creator, this series CSI Skill Tree is so flattering and exciting because it treats games as valid cultural and scientific objects and brings in subject matter experts. And it's rare we get games get all kinds of analysis, but that's a very rare one. So definitely appreciate being able to be involved. Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you
Yes,
so
thank
much.
you so much. This is a real treat for me. So thank you. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, have a great rest of the day, and thank you so much for your time. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.